My name is Ethan Carter, and the strangest thing I've ever done in my life was leave 120 luxury homes without heat during the coldest week of winter. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I lost my temper, but because I finally got tired of watching people steal from my family while pretending they were the victims. Looking back now, I still remember standing beside my old wood stove with a mug of black coffee in my hand, watching emergency vehicles drive through the gates of the wealthiest neighborhood outside Bozeman, and I couldn't help thinking how one simple decision had exposed years of lies that nobody expected to come to light. If you think this is a story about some angry guy fighting an HOA, it isn't. It's really a story about what happens when people convince themselves that if someone is quiet long enough, they must also be weak. I grew up on 9 acres my grandfather bought back in the 70s, long before anybody dreamed of building luxury homes out here. Back then, it was mostly open pasture, grazing cattle, an endless sky. Grandpa used to sit on the porch every evening with an old coffee cup in one hand and tell me that land had a memory. As a kid, I thought he was just saying old rancher things. But after everything that happened, I finally understood exactly what he meant. When he passed away, he left me the property, an aging cedar house with peeling paint, a red barn that leaned just enough to make visitors nervous, and a detached garage where I spent most evenings rebuilding diesel engines. It wasn't much to look at, but it was home. The smell of grease, motor oil, cedar smoke, and fresh-cut firewood meant more to me than polished marble floors ever could. Over the years, everything around me changed. Ranches disappeared one by one. Developers came in with glossy brochures and promises about exclusive communities. Eventually, Aspen Summit Estates surrounded my little piece of land with enormous homes worth several $1,000,000 each. Perfect landscaping, imported stone, heated driveways, private tennis courts, luxury SUVs parked like they belonged in commercials. Their security gate looked more expensive than my entire house, and every time I drove past it, the guards barely acknowledged I existed. Honestly, I never cared. I wasn't jealous. I didn't want their lifestyle. I liked hearing coyotes at night instead of neighborhood parties. I liked repairing tractors instead of attending HOA meetings. I liked knowing every fence post on my property because I'd driven every one of them into the ground myself. As far as I was concerned, they could enjoy their neighborhood, and I'd enjoy mine. We didn't have to like each other to leave each other alone. Apparently, the board of directors saw things differently. Looking back, there were little signs I ignored. Survey crews showing up without notice, contractors parking suspiciously close to my fence, expensive trucks cutting across the edge of my pasture before quickly turning around whenever they noticed me watching. At the time, I figured developers were always measuring something, and I had enough work to keep me busy without worrying about theirs. Then January arrived with one of the harshest cold fronts Montana had seen in years. Temperatures stayed well below zero day after day. The kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe too deeply. One Thursday morning, I grabbed my insulated jacket and walked my fence line after a snowstorm, mostly checking for broken posts and fallen branches. About halfway across the pasture, I noticed something that instantly felt wrong. Fresh dirt. Not a lot, but enough to stand out against ground that should have been frozen solid. Somebody had dug there recently. I climbed over the drift and knelt beside a narrow trench where the edge of a steel pipe peeked through the frost. 6 inches across. Fresh weld marks. Industrial coating. Definitely not something installed by accident. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly saying to myself, "Well, that's interesting." My old Labrador, Duke, sniffed around the trench, then looked at me like he was waiting for me to explain why strangers were burying things on our land. I followed the pipe as far as I could until it disappeared beneath a decorative row of pine trees planted just inside Aspen Summit Estates. Beyond those trees sat a large, mechanical building I'd barely noticed before. Steam drifted from rooftop vents into the freezing morning air. My first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. Nobody had ever asked permission to cross my property. Nobody had contacted me about an easement. Nobody from the county had left notices. Something about the entire situation felt hidden on purpose. Most people probably would have marched straight to the HOA office demanding answers. I did something my grandfather taught me years earlier instead. I went looking for paperwork before looking for an argument. That afternoon, after finishing work at the repair shop, I drove downtown to the county records office. An older clerk named Margaret recognized my last name almost immediately. She smiled and said, "Your grandfather was Daniel Carter, wasn't he?" I nodded. "Best negotiator this county ever had," she laughed. That man never signed anything until he'd read every single word twice. We spent nearly 3 hours pulling old property files from storage. Dust covered half the folders, but every document was perfectly preserved. Original surveys, warranty deeds, mineral agreements, tax records. I wasn't even sure what I hoped to find until one page stopped me cold. Near the middle of the original deed, highlighted decades earlier in faded yellow marker, sat several lines most buyers would have skipped without thinking twice. Exclusive mineral ownership, natural gas extraction rights, underground resource control. I blinked and read it again, then a third time. Margaret noticed my expression. "Find something?" she asked. I slowly turned the document toward her without saying a word. She adjusted her glasses, read the paragraph herself, then looked back at me with raised eyebrows. "Well," she whispered, "that's probably going to make somebody's week a whole lot worse." We spread several geological maps across the table, comparing property boundaries with underground survey records. That's when the real surprise appeared. The natural gas reservoir supplying Aspen Summit Estates wasn't beneath their neighborhood at all. It sat almost entirely beneath my 9 acres. Their heating system depended on gas that legally belonged to my family, and because municipal gas lines never reached that part of the valley, there was no practical backup. Somebody, somewhere, had made the decision years earlier to run a pipeline across my land without permission instead of negotiating with the rightful owner. I carefully folded every copy, thanked Margaret for her help, and drove home in complete silence. The sun was setting behind the mountains when I parked beside my garage. Duke ran toward me wagging his tail like every other evening, completely unaware that the quiet little property he'd called home for years had just become the center of a secret worth millions of dollars. Standing there in the fading light, one thought kept repeating in my head over and over. This wasn't an honest mistake. Somebody had known exactly what they were doing. And if they were willing to steal natural gas beneath my feet for years without asking, I had a feeling this was only the beginning of everything I was about to uncover. Ethan Carter had never been the kind of man who acted on anger. Mostly because diesel engines teach you something about life. If you rush the repair, you usually end up making the damage worse. So instead of driving over to Aspen Summit Estates and demanding answers, I spent the next several days proving every single fact before anyone even knew I had discovered the pipeline. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to a licensed petroleum engineer named Grant Holloway, a man my grandfather had trusted years before whenever anything involved underground utilities or mineral rights. I told him I thought someone had crossed my property without permission, and I wanted to know exactly what I owned before I opened my mouth. 2 mornings later, he pulled into my driveway with survey equipment, thermal imaging tools, and enough paperwork to fill the bed of his pickup. We spent almost 6 hours walking every inch of the property while he traced the underground line using specialized equipment. Every 100 feet he stopped, marked coordinates, and quietly nodded to himself. Finally, he stood beside the trench where I'd first noticed the disturbed soil and looked at me. "Ethan, whoever built this knew exactly where your property line was." I frowned. "Meaning?" He tapped one of the survey stakes. "Meaning this wasn't an accident. They crossed onto your land because they had to. The gas pocket doesn't extend under their neighborhood. Without this section, they don't have heat." Hearing someone else say it out loud somehow made the situation feel even bigger. We followed the pipeline until it entered the mechanical station serving Aspen Summit. Grant examined pressure gauges through the exterior service panel and whistled softly. "This entire development depends on this feed." "Every house?" I asked. "Every single one." I leaned against the fence without saying anything. Suddenly, the million-dollar homes surrounding my little property didn't seem nearly as untouchable as they had the week before. Grant looked over at me. "You planning to sue?" I shook my head. "Not yet." "Good," he replied. "Because if this is what I think it is, you've got more leverage than a lawsuit." The next step was hiring an attorney, not because I wanted to start a fight, but because I refused to make one mistake that could erase everything. My lawyer, Rebecca Lawson, had spent 20 years dealing with property disputes across Montana. After reviewing the deed, the county records, and Grant's inspection report, she slowly closed the folder and smiled in a way that reminded me of a chess player spotting checkmate 6 moves ahead. "Ethan," she said calmly, "they've been extracting privately owned natural gas without permission, without compensation, and apparently without a recorded easement." "That's illegal?" I asked. She laughed. "Illegal is the polite word." Over the following week, we quietly collected everything: drone photographs, county surveys, pressure logs, construction permits, or more accurately, the complete absence of construction permits. Rebecca even discovered that Aspen Summit's original developer had dissolved years earlier after selling control of the community to the Homeowners Association. Somewhere during that transition, the pipeline had simply become everyone's little secret, except nobody had bothered telling the man who actually owned the land underneath it. The more evidence we gathered, the stranger everything became. Several retired contractors privately admitted they remembered crews working late at night during the neighborhood's construction nearly 6 years earlier. One even remembered asking why they were crossing private pasture instead of requesting access. According to him, a project manager laughed and said, "The old rancher won't notice." They weren't talking about me. They were talking about my grandfather, a man already battling cancer during his final months. I remember sitting in my truck after hearing that story, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't even about the money anymore. They hadn't just stolen resources. They had waited until an old man couldn't defend what belonged to him. That's the moment I decided I wasn't going to let this quietly disappear behind closed doors. Rebecca agreed we still needed to act carefully. "You're absolutely within your rights," she explained. "But timing matters. If you simply cut service without documenting everything first, they'll try painting you as the villain." "So what do?" She smiled. "We make sure every step is legal enough that a judge could frame it on the courthouse wall." Grant returned with a licensed utility contractor who installed a master shutoff valve exactly at my property boundary. Industrial grade, tamper-resistant, fully inspected, county approved, every permit filed correctly, every photograph time-stamped, every inspection signed. Watching that steel valve being bolted into place felt strangely ordinary considering what it represented. One turn, that was all it would take. Rebecca looked at me before leaving. "Remember something." "What's that? You're not taking anything away from them?" She tapped the deed resting on my truck hood. "You're simply deciding whether strangers are allowed to keep using your property." That sentence stayed with me for days. The weather forecast predicted an Arctic front arriving Thursday night. Temperatures expected to drop to -21 degrees before sunrise. Friday morning, I woke before daylight, brewed coffee, fed Duke, and walked toward the valve wearing insulated gloves. Snow crunched beneath my boots. Steam still drifted from Aspen Summit's heating station in the distance. I stood there longer than I expected, staring at that steel handle. Part of me wondered whether someone from the HOA would suddenly appear and apologize before it came to this. Nobody did. I slowly unlocked the housing, placed my hand on the valve, and turned it exactly 90 degrees until it stopped. Click. That was it. No explosion, no alarms, no dramatic music, just silence. I locked the housing again, slipped the key into my pocket, and walked back toward the house. About 3 hours later, I noticed the first signs. The steam above the mechanical building disappeared. Maintenance trucks began driving through the neighborhood. By lunchtime, I could see people standing outside wrapped in heavy coats talking to one another. Their heated driveways slowly disappeared beneath fresh snow. Late that afternoon, my neighbor from the next ranch, old Frank Delaney, stopped by carrying 2 cups of coffee. He leaned against my porch railing and looked toward Aspen Summit. "Looks busy over there." "Sure does." He glanced sideways at me. "Anything to do with that survey crew I'd been seeing?" I smiled without answering. Frank chuckled. "That's probably smart." By evening, the outside temperature had fallen below zero. Through my binoculars, I could see maintenance workers opening access panels, checking meters, making frantic phone calls. They never once walked onto my property. Maybe they already knew why. Maybe they were afraid to find out. Saturday morning, local plumbing companies started arriving one after another. Frozen pipes, cold radiators, heat pumps failing because there was no gas feeding the central system. Families began loading luggage into expensive SUVs. Children bundled beneath blankets climbed into back seats while frustrated parents argued beside driveways. Around noon, I spotted a familiar white Mercedes stopping outside the community clubhouse. A woman stepped out wearing a designer winter coat with sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Claire Whitmore, president of the Aspen Summit HOA. I'd only spoken to her twice in my life. Once when she asked whether I'd consider repainting my barn because it was visible from their clubhouse. The second time when she suggested I should replace my rusted mailbox because it affected neighboring property values. I politely declined both conversations. Now she looked considerably less confident. Maintenance supervisors gathered around her pointing toward maps and utility diagrams. Even from half a mile away, I could tell nobody liked the answers they were hearing. Saturday evening, the local television station aired its first report. An unexplained heating failure has affected the luxury Aspen Summit community. They announced while cameras showed frozen fountains, maintenance crews, and residents carrying portable heaters into their homes. Watching the broadcast felt surreal. They still didn't know the real story. They believed it was a mechanical breakdown. I knew it was 6 years of arrogance finally meeting one old property deed. Sunday morning, everything changed. 2 black SUVs rolled into my driveway. Claire Whitmore stepped out first, followed by a sharply dressed attorney carrying a leather briefcase. Claire forced a smile that disappeared the second she realized I wasn't smiling back. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I believe we've had a misunderstanding." I looked at Rebecca, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier expecting exactly this moment. She simply nodded once, silently telling me, "Now the real conversation begins." Monday morning started with a knock that sounded very different from the one Claire Whitmore had made 2 days earlier. There was no confidence behind it this time, no carefully rehearsed smile, no expensive sunglasses hiding behind polished arrogance. When I opened the door, she stood there beside her attorney holding a thick leather folder and what looked like the weight of the entire neighborhood on her shoulders. She didn't waste time pretending we were equals in a negotiation anymore. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "the board has voted unanimously to accept your terms." Rebecca stood beside me with her own copy of the agreement already marked up in yellow tabs. She accepted the folder, flipped through every page one last time, then handed it to me without saying a word. Every signature was there. Every resolution had been approved. Every legal acknowledgement we demanded had been executed exactly as written. Claire slowly reached into another envelope and slid a certified cashier's check across my kitchen table. "This covers the retroactive damages." I looked down at the number for only a second before placing it back on the table. It wasn't excitement I felt. It wasn't victory either. Honestly, it was relief. For weeks, I'd been carrying the weight of wondering whether I'd somehow become the bad guy simply by defending something my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. Rebecca broke the silence. "There's one more document." Claire nodded and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "The board's public apology." She looked embarrassed even saying the words. The letter admitted that the previous leadership had authorized construction across private property without obtaining a legal easement, acknowledged that the homeowners had never been fully informed about the origin of their natural gas supply, and accepted responsibility for every consequence that followed. Copies would be mailed to every resident in Aspen Summit. Nobody could hide behind rumors anymore, because the truth would arrive in every mailbox. I signed the final page. Rebecca notarized the documents, and the attorney quietly gathered his copies. Before leaving, Claire stopped at the doorway and looked back at me. "Can I ask you something?" I shrugged. "Sure. If we'd simply asked your grandfather, do you think he would have agreed?" I smiled because I already knew the answer. "He probably would have made you coffee first. Then he would have negotiated a fair deal." Claire lowered her eyes and gave a slow nod. "We should have done that." After they drove away, I walked across the frozen pasture carrying the small brass key I'd kept in my jacket pocket since the valve had been installed. The wind cut across the fields hard enough to sting my face, but it didn't bother me much. I unlocked the protective housing, wrapped my hand around the steel handle, and slowly turned it back to its original position. Within seconds, the pressure gauge began climbing. A low vibration traveled through the pipeline beneath my boots. A few moments later, steam rose once again from the central utility building inside Aspen Summit. Heat flowed back into 120 homes. But this time, it wasn't being stolen. This time, every cubic foot moving through that pipeline was moving under a legal agreement signed by everyone involved. Over the next several weeks, the neighborhood changed in ways I never expected. 4 HOA board members resigned permanently. Independent auditors uncovered years of poor record-keeping that had nothing to do with me. Several homeowners personally stopped by my property to apologize for assumptions they'd made about me, simply because my old house didn't match the rest of the community. One retired couple even brought homemade cinnamon rolls and admitted they believed the board's version of the story until they read the apology letter. "We thought you shut off the gas out of spite," the husband admitted. I laughed. "If it had been spite, I would have done it years ago." We all laughed after that. Funny how much easier conversations become once everyone is finally working with the same facts. The settlement money allowed me to replace my grandfather's leaking roof, rebuild the old barn, expand my repair shop, and create a savings account I never imagined I'd have. But the thing I value most isn't any of that. It's the fact that every engineer, contractor, Or, inspector who needs access to that pipeline now calls ahead before stepping onto my land. They introduce themselves. They ask permission. They shake my hand. Respect, that's really all this was ever about. My grandfather used to tell me that land remembers who protects it. Standing on my porch these days, watching another Montana sunset spread across the valley, I finally understand exactly what he meant. The pipeline is still there. The gas still flows. The neighborhood still enjoys warm homes every winter. The only difference is that everyone now remembers whose land they're standing beside and why boundaries exist in the first place. So I'd honestly like to hear your opinion. If you discovered someone had secretly used your property and your family's natural resources for years without ever asking permission, would you have accepted the same settlement, or would you have taken them to court for even more? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle, and I'm curious to see which side you'd be on.